Hello and welcome to LAC II. Today we are starting our Reading for Meaning unit and we are going to do an overview of some of the elements and techniques of fiction. So what is fiction? I'm sure everybody out there has their own definition of fiction, but it's pretty short and simple. What do you think fiction is? Of course, everybody knows that fiction is any writing that is not real. It's a made-up story. So today we're going to look at some of the common elements of fiction and also talk about what are some of the techniques that authors use when writing fiction. Elements of fiction. Here are the different things we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about description, plot, conflicts, foreshadowing, and characterization. So first off is description. Description. Super important for any writer, especially a fiction writer, is that they want you to feel like you are in the story. To do this, they add lots of sensory descriptions. So you can see over here some examples. So for sight, instead of just saying the socks were on the floor, a good author might write, the muddy socks were piled on top of the rug. It gives you a little bit more of a picture, not just socks, but muddy socks, and not that they were just on the floor, but now we've got piles of them, giving you the idea that something's going on here. There's lots of, maybe somebody's a slob, maybe somebody works outside for a living. We're not really sure, but it gives you a definite better picture. A few more examples here. The plane flew over versus the buzzing sound filled the air. For touching, the mud was gross. Down here we have the mud felt slimy and cold between my toes. Oh, I can almost feel that. Can you? For taste, the pizza was yucky. How many little kids say yucky because they don't have the proper words to really try to describe it? But a good author does. The pizza tasted like cardboard. Very nice. And lastly, we have smell. Her perfume smelled good versus her perfume smelled like flowers and vanilla. Very nice. Okay, so think about it whether you're reading or writing. The interesting stuff is really in the detail. And again, a good author wants you to feel like you're part of it. The more details they can give, the more you can imagine the different sights, sounds, and sensory things going on in the story. So think about this. She walked into the living room. Picture that in your head. Okay, you probably have the picture of a living room in your head, probably your living room. But if the author doesn't give you lots of details, you might not know exactly what that living room looked like. So let's see, here's one. Here's another. Did what you pictured look like either of these rooms? Without description, you're left to wonder what the author is seeing for the characters or meaning for the story. Over here we have a super modern room. Over here we have a Victorian room. Which room do you like better? Could you describe each room using maybe 2 or 3 words? Pick one room and try it. How would you, as an author, describe one of these 2 rooms? Okay, good. Moving on. Every story has a plot, and I'm sure that everybody in here has seen this, right? It says down here, raise your hand if you've seen this before. So go ahead and raise your hand so I know you're paying attention while I'm watching you do the lesson in class. So on the plot line, of course, we have the exposition. This is where you learn about the characters, the setting of the story. It's the background information that you need to move forward. The next point is down here at the bottom. This is your inciting incident. This is where the conflict is introduced. The rising action is where the main character or characters are trying to deal with the conflict, rising all the way up to the climax. This is the major event that occurs. Or maybe even a decision is made by the main character. This is where the conflict is dealt with. The falling action over here, this is the consequence of that major event or of the decision that has been made, all the things that happen because of that. And then sometimes you might have a turning point and a last moment of surprise, but generally the falling action will lead you to the resolution of the story, where there's either a happily ever after or, in the case of many Shakespeare plays, everybody's dead. Either way, you know you've come to the end of the story. And then there is conflicts. So we want to look a little closer at conflicts. There's no such thing as a story that starts with "and they lived happily ever after." It just doesn't happen that way. If you want a good story, stories need a conflict, some kind of problem to be solved. Every story revolves around the conflict and the resolution of that problem. There are 2 main types of conflicts in stories, internal and external. And if you have been paying attention, you probably know this. An internal conflict over here is some kind of struggle that takes place inside a character's mind where he has to make a decision or learn something, change something about their own personality, or an external conflict, which is a struggle between a character and some kind of outside force. You've probably learned about man versus nature, man versus society, man versus maybe even the supernatural. Those would be external kinds of conflicts. So let's take a look at this one. Calvin and Hobbes, go ahead, take a second and try to decide whether or not this is an internal conflict or an external conflict for poor little Calvin. Okay, remember when an internal conflict is part of a story, the character needs, that should say needs, to make a decision or grow in some way by the end. There has to be a lesson learned or a change in a personality flaw. If this does not happen, the story usually does not end well for that character. That lesson learned, by the way, is what we call the theme. The reason the author is telling you this story about this character is because the author wants you to learn this lesson or to pass this message of their theme along to the readers. So have you ever watched or read something and found it extremely predictable? Foreshadowing. Okay, that's when the author gives clues as to what will happen later in the story. Okay, sometimes you might watch something that's predictable, and sometimes, I don't know why those are out there. Sometimes the clues are obvious and sometimes not. That's usually because the foreshadowing is not very subtle. I thought this was cute, little foreshadowing. Anakin Skywalker, he will later become Darth Vader. Yay! Okay. And of course, there's no story without the characters. All about characterization. A good character is one that we can connect with. The best ones are the ones that you miss when the story is over. They're ones that you remember. So if I were to say, who is your favorite character, who do you immediately think of? The character that you put is probably a character that was very well developed, whether it be in a book or in a movie. And there are many ways an author builds a character. There are two different ways of building a character: direct characterization and indirect characterization, and then under each one there are some different techniques. But under direct characterization, this is when the writer tells the reader what kind of person the character is. You'll see this a lot in shows, TV shows, where there's a narrator telling you, this is what my life is like, this is what I am like. Or if they're telling the story of somebody else. That's direct characterization, and sometimes you'll see that in literature as well. One example I can think of is the show How I Met Your Mother. Always at the beginning of the show there's some kind of direct characterization, telling his story, explaining what his character and the people in the story in the show are doing or what they were like. Then you have indirect characterization, and this is when the writer gives clues to the reader about what kind of person the character is. These are clues. These are things that you have to figure out as you're reading the story. And you do that through the character's appearance, through the character's words in the story, like what they say and what they do, through the character's actions, and also through the reaction of other characters to that character. So, maybe a character behaves in one way, but other characters react differently. So all of those are 4 different methods of indirect characterization. So again, that was a brief overview of the elements of fiction. These are things that you're going to want to keep in mind as we move forward and read our stories over the next couple of weeks. Again, we went over description, plot, conflicts, foreshadowing, and characterization. If you have any questions, please be sure to ask me, and I will see you back in class.